Welcome to Inflation, Tariffs, and Trends in Durables. My name is Stacy Hughes, and I'm the moderator and co-host for today's session. Now I'd like to introduce our host for today's webinar, Ralph McLaughlin. Ralph is our chief economist here at OpenBrand. I'm going to let him tell you a little bit more about his background and what he does here at OpenBrand.
Well, thanks everyone for registering and attending. Without going into I guess too much unnecessary detail, I am a recovering academic. I spent gosh, a good part of a decade either as a PhD student or as a full-time professor at several universities. I sort of cut my teeth in the housing market as a housing economist, but have done work in several other, I guess, subsectors. I've done work in industrial economics, applied econometrics, data analysis, forecasting. I most recently came from Realtor.com, where I headed up forecasting and market measurement capabilities at Realtor.com. I've been at other startups, as well as Zillow and Trulia, where I was chief economist there, and also served some time at CoreLogic, where I was in charge of market insights and market metric engineering. So yeah, so I have a lot of experience in creating new metrics and forecasting where those metrics are going to go, and very excited today to talk about two new capabilities that we have at OpenBrand. One is the Consumer Price Index, and then the other is the OpenBrand Market Forecast Suite. So here we go. This is the agenda for today, and it's really 5 different sections. One, we're going to talk about the Consumer Price Index. I'll talk a little bit about what it is, and then also some takeaways from that. The second is that there are a lot of unanswered questions about the impacts of tariffs and pricing, partially because we're still in very volatile and potentially early days with respect to the impacts of tariffs on pricing. But there is value in not just trying to observe or measure what's happening with tariffs and pricing, but also how to think about what we might expect in going forward, and also how to think about tariffs in your business. There are, even though we may not have concrete answers for how tariffs is going to affect pricing, we should be able to at least come up with a framework or a rationale for whether or not particular products will likely see more impact from tariffs or less of an impact. So we'll go through that. Then Stacy's going to take us through consumer sentiment by category. We've run, we have one of the longest running consumer surveys in the country, and we have some results from recent questions we've asked consumers. I'll then take the reins back and talk about our expectations of the impact of not just tariffs, but the future of the economic environment. And I'll forecast or I'll preview our forecast suite, which is not just on pricing, though we have that here. It's also on shipments and retail sales, and also I'll give you some examples or describe some of our BYOD, bring your own data forecasting capabilities that we have at OpenBrand, and then we'll open up to questions. First things first, let's talk about the OpenBrand Consumer Price Index and what we're seeing thus far. So in a nutshell, there are only two other data sources out there, or market pricing metrics that are available, at least to the public. One is the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index, CPI, and then the other is the Bureau of Economic Analysis's PCE, or Personal Consumption Expenditure Survey. So those are two measurements of price movements and price stability. Now, one thing that at least for me, that's important, as well as it should be important for other folks, is that if you're trying to figure out what's actually happening, it is a good idea to not just rely on one source of information. It is important to rely not just on two sources of information, if you can, on the same phenomenon that you're interested in figuring out what's happening. But really, it's three. And the reason why it's important to have three is that you then have, if you only have two measures, for example, one measure can move one direction, the other can move another direction, and you may be at a loss for knowing which one's not telling the truth, or maybe which one's going in a direction that maybe you don't care about. So if you have a third measure that allows you to triangulate, if there are any geographers out here or anyone who's used a compass, there are ways that you can actually triangulate where you're at if you have three different points of reference. It allows you to easily identify sort of what's actually happening or where you're at. So the reason I mention this is that the OpenBrand CPI actually now provides this third data point. It's not just the CPI. It's not just the PCE, so we're not relying just on data sources from the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Bureau of Economic Analysis, but also this proprietary third-party measure, which we're calling the OpenBrand CPI.
Well,
yes.
We have some initial poll results for the question that we posed: on a scale of 1 to 5, how concerned is your business with tariffs? And we had 5 here, very concerned. 5 votes so far for very concerned. That's the response right now. The what's coming in, slightly concerned and no concern at all are very low, if not at all. No one has no concern. There is concern across the board. Yeah, we see it. Would love to hear more results. If you can vote, please do so. But overall, very concerned. 5 is the response that is winning for sure.
Very, very concerned. Okay, very well, I mean that's probably a better. I mean, it shows that you all care, so that's good. It's better than maybe not care at all, or no concern, because they absolutely should be concerned. In a volatile environment that we're in, there's a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty can certainly lead to concern. So that's good. So I guess there's some, tentatively good news that we can share here from the OpenBrand CPI recap. And the good news is that so far we're not seeing widespread jumps in prices. So overall, we do have our measure, our consumer price index for durables and personal goods, or our CPI DPG is what we're calling it. And we did see an acceleration from February. So on the right side of this column, in the upper right, we see that the OpenBrand CPI moved by 0.1% on a month-over-month basis in February. In March, that accelerated to 0.2. So, okay, the pessimist is going to say that doubled, but it's really a very small increase, right? It went from 0.1 to 0.2. So that's the good news. And many of the categories that we cover, we actually didn't see in aggregate any price increases. So for communication, we break out our consumer price index by different groups, right? So our 5 groups are appliances, communication, which includes things like tablets and cell phones, home improvement, which I think pretty self-explanatory, personal care, that's going to be hair care products, skincare products, so on and so forth. And then recreational goods. Recreational goods primarily in our measure includes things like headphones and speakers and gaming computers and things of that nature. So, if we look at categories or our groups, like our communication groups, we saw flat growth. Things did not grow on a month-over-month basis in February, and they continued to be flat in March. Home improvement, we saw upward movement in February, but we saw flat movement in March. Personal care, we saw some upward movement in February. We saw some flat movement or deceleration in March. So for those three categories, we really didn't see any signs at all that prices were actually rising. In fact, we saw some deflationary pressures, which actually has been the trend over the last 24 months, has actually been deflationary. The two categories, however, that we have that are contributing to the growth are appliances and recreation. And for recreation, we didn't see really any change from February to March. So it's hard to attribute that 0.3% increase on a month-over-month basis to anything tariff related, because price growth has been fairly solid in that particular category. However, the one category, or the one group, I should say, that did see the biggest increase was in appliances. So in February, the month-over-month growth was flat, was 0%, and that jumped to 0.4% in March. So there's some evidence there that the increase in prices, potentially as a result of tariffs, is actually hitting the appliance side more than any of the other categories. Just for validation and credibility, here I want to show you this chart that actually does show that our measure, which is in sort of the lighter purple, very much follows the BLS's measure. And in fact, if you include the BEA's measure of prices, the PCE, it follows a very similar trajectory. So, for example, in December, the BLS showed 0.2, and we showed 0.3. In January, we both showed a much larger increase, a jump in price growth, and then that price growth sort of settled back down in February and March. So, we very much do follow on a, not just overall, but also on a group and category basis. When available, we very much follow how the BLS measures. We have the advantage, though, just to give a shameless plug here, we do have the advantage of actually producing this on a weekly basis. So if there's interest in tracking not just monthly movements, but weekly movements, that is available on a subscription basis. So we can track these things on a week-over-week basis. And then even more information that what the BLS provides, we can provide some sourcing information on why prices are changing. So we can tell you whether or not prices changed because there was an increase in the frequency of discounts. So we can tell you overall, did prices, say, go down or go up because there was more or less discounting activity? Or we can tell you, did prices go up and down because the typical discounts went up or down? So we have that information. And we can, of course, tell you whether or not prices went up or down because there was a change in an actual list price. So we have all that detailed information that the BLS and the BEA don't report on, at least in the aggregate. So here is the broader measure of our CPI durable personal goods. We can see that sort of inflation in this category, didn't start of late. We really saw inflation kick up, as you all know. The elephant in the room was COVID, right? COVID caused all sorts of issues with supply chains, and then on top of that, we had a bunch of stimulus that was out there, and that caused prices to rise pretty sharply, right? And we saw this period kind of in 2020, end of 2022, into 2023, and even into 2024. We did see a little bit of a jump in early 2024. We saw a period kind of relative price stability, but then of recent, going back at the end of last year, we did start to see overall price growth start to accelerate again. Again, not to the levels that we saw during COVID, but we did start to see some re-acceleration there. So the accelerations, of course, of recent aren't totally due to the tariff environment, but there are some signs that at least in the appliance category, it is. And this is, if we actually look at the appliances category, or sorry, the appliances group, we did see the initial jump in prices that was caused due to the pandemic. So in 2020, we saw price growth really accelerate. But then after that subsided and people stopped buying homes, not stopped buying homes, but they made their COVID move and they made their COVID purchases, the price of appliances actually started to come back down. And this wasn't just our consumer price index showing this, the BLS's showed this too, that the prices of appliances started to come back down until you get to March of this year, really February and March, which is when tariffs started to be put in place. Then we started seeing signs that this overall trend was starting to hit an inflection point. So, this kink in the curve does certainly, I think, tell us that any price changes, at least in the appliance category, seem to be really bucking the trend of what was overall a deflationary period for appliances. And in fact, if we break this down even further, and not only can we get more granular in our consumer price index from a temporal perspective, so we can go from months to weeks as an example, but we can also get very granular when it comes to the CPI for different categories. And in fact, if you break down what some of the largest drivers of recent price growth acceleration of appliances were, it predominantly was in these categories: tops and wall ovens, dishwashers, laundry, microwaves, refrigerators, and ranges. And in particular, we saw some of the biggest growth occurring in ranges, in microwaves, and in laundry products. So those are appliances that seem to be exhibiting the largest acceleration in price growth, just even from February to March here. This is that recreation category I was telling about earlier. It has exhibited pretty strong price growth since 2020. We don't see, like appliances, we don't see this curve flattening out or even decelerating like we see with appliances. So whatever's happening in this recreation category, and I did look this up this morning, it mostly, the strong trajectory in the recreation category is actually mostly being driven by prices that are on that are in the speakers VAW category, which is like voice speakers, so speakers that can very clearly project voices, not just music, and then also in the headphone category too. So we think there's still some components that have sort of permanently are getting more more expensive as inputs to headphones, and that's at least driving growth in that category. So we don't think that the increase in or the acceleration in price growth in this category is, as at least yet, is not necessarily due to tariffs. Although there is this possibility here that this rate of increase could steepen. And if that were to be the case, then that would be a sign that maybe tariffs are starting to impact that recreation category. These other categories, I won't really go into in a ton more detail here, but if you look at these other groups, I should say, not categories, these groups: communication, relatively flat. Home improvement. Yeah, okay, we see growth. We see this line go from the bottom left to the upper right, which does indicate growth, but it's not nearly to the extent that it was in other categories. And in fact, home improvement, over the last several months does seem to be leveling off. Again, these things, I'm not saying that they won't necessarily reaccelerate. It's possible, but a lot of that is going to be due to what is policy du jour. I mean, we are getting policy changes on a day-to-day basis. So I can't. I don't want to tell you how many times I've had to revise this presentation because of changes in policies, but it's been more than once. And of course, revisions to our forecast. Although we're starting to slow down that, but for the last couple of weeks, it's been policy change on a day-to-day basis. And same with personal care. It's been, certainly we've seen price growth, but this is kind of on par with overall inflation trends, and nothing that we can at least immediately attribute to the tariff environment. So, sort of the next step here before I hand it off to Stacy is actually to paint or provide more of a framework with how, what is tariffs, and how would you actually want to think about tariffs and how it might affect your pricing. All right, so just again, excuse this is me for the macroeconomics 101 here, but I just want to make sure kind of we start from a common point here. So what is tariffs? Essentially, tariff is just a tax on imported goods, and it makes them more expensive. And in general, tariffs are considered regressive in that they do tend to affect lower income earners more on a percentage basis than higher income earners, just because things constitute a higher share of a lower income household's budget than a higher income household's budget. A dishwasher, for example, is going to constitute more of the budget of a lower income household than it is of a higher income household. Even if that higher income household goes up market and buys a more expensive dishwasher, overall, it does tend to be lower. So if you have a tax on these goods, it will tend to hit lower income households more than higher income households. That's, I guess, less relevant for the rest of the conversation, but it is sort of a generally accepted principle with respect to just tariffs in general. So there are two types of tariffs. One are sort of specific tariffs or fixed fee per unit tariffs. And that means, say, for, every car that's imported into the US, we add $100 fee on it. That's a fixed fee per unit, regardless of the value of that car. And the more common, and what we're seeing today, is actually called ad valorem tariffs. And that is when the tariff is a percentage of value. So if we say, for example, in the current trade war, that we have a universal 10% tariff on all goods coming into the US, well, that's an ad valorem a type of tariff or tax. We had we had threatened, and again, you can see how quickly things are changing. China specific 125% ad valorem, which then went up to whatever 150, and now it's paused for 90 days, and now we have exceptions for certain goods, electronics, for example, components. We have carve outs. But generally speaking, that's just, I want to make sure we're on the same page. That's what tariffs are, and those are the two types of tariffs that we have. Now, getting more specifically about how we think tariffs affect pricing, or how we should start to think about it, there are two higher level effects. Generally speaking, they will make the tariff good more expensive to consumers. And that's not just from the direct effect, which is very obvious, right? Is we put a tax on this thing and it becomes more expensive, right? So that's a direct effect. But there's an indirect effect, which is that domestic producers might increase prices because there's less competition. If the law of supply and demand, really the law of demand kicks in, that if prices rise, demand falls. That means we import less foreign goods. It means there's less competition for domestic products. And as a result, we could see prices rise. So I'm not saying we're seeing this, but the point is that there's two independent effects that we might see from tariffs on pricing. And then there's, of course, short-term versus long-term impacts. So in the short term, we could see higher consumer prices. We're starting to maybe see some signs that's happening, but not in a broad sense. We could see prices rise, or more activity in the short run as consumers rush to spend to avoid price increases. They want to bring those purchases forward. We could see some lower competition. We might see more inflationary pressures. And in the short term, we could see retaliatory tariffs, and we've seen this in some cases. And in the long run, however, there's a lot of question marks around these, because sometimes trade wars don't often last, and we come to mutually beneficial agreements. But there could be some outcomes that we don't know the answer to in the long run. Example of this could be, do we get fairer competition? I know that's one of the at least explicitly stated goals of the Trump administration, is they want competition to be more fair, more apples to apples. Whether or not that actually happens remains to be seen, but that could be a potential outcome. Another is that maybe we see growth and protection of infant industries. Example of this from previous administrations has been tariffs on electric cars made abroad, that we've put high tariffs on those cars, high enough so that they really don't get imported into the U.S. And maybe that helps protect, infant industries, electric vehicle manufacturing in the U.S., like say Tesla or Rivian. We might get some protection of those industries. For some other products, there may be very, very valid reasons why we want to actually only produce them in the U.S. So, for reasons that have to do with national security or securing supply chains. So semiconductors, for an example, since semiconductors are in everything, including our defense products, there may be a rationale to, put up such high tariff walls that we want to produce them domestically. And then, of course, if we do have protection of some domestic industries, we might see, domestic production increase of certain goods, and as a result, maybe job growth in that particular industry. So this is this is not a panacea for how you actually think about, how tariffs are going to increase or decrease or have a negligible effect on pricing, but it's a way to start thinking about this. So you can start up here on the left-hand corner, and these are questions that you want to ask yourself about your business, your product, to determine whether or not should we expect a higher pricing impact, a medium pricing impact, or a low pricing impact. And one of the obvious questions is the product or the input, if you're talking about input, made in a high tariff country? Well, okay, if it's not made in a high tariff country, then, which today is really just China, 10% I would say is not huge, relatively speaking. Then if it's not made in a high tariff country, you can pretty much just think, okay, all right, it's probably not going to be a huge impact. If it is made in a high tariff country, then there are some other questions you want to ask yourself. Okay, there's possible high pricing, but let's dig further. Okay, is the simple one is here, if you go down below, do you expect the tariff environment to be short-lived or long-lived? Well, if this is all, short-run game theory that the administrations, because it's not just the U.S., it's negotiations with other countries. If this is all just a big effort to negotiate, marginally better terms, and we think it's going to be short-lived, then, maybe we don't think the impact to be very high, either because the end result, the effect of tariffs that eventually will be in place for the long run are small, or because we think it's all going to resolve itself very quickly. We might get manufacturers and retailers that just decide to eat the cost of the tariff in the short run and not be bothered with changing a bunch of prices, and then sort of get back to business as usual in just a few months. So that's a possibility. Another question is your product a high margin or low margin? If it's low margin, then there really is very little inability for the producers to actually absorb some of that cost, so the price impact could be high. If it's a high margin product, then sort of it's uncertain. If it's a high margin, some producers or retailers may decide to eat some of the costs. Some may decide to pass it on. So it may be like a medium or a low impact. And then another question, again, this isn't exhaustive, but another question is, how was the product itself used or sold? If it's just an input into, a product that's actually produced here in the U.S., then, the impact maybe is going to be medium or low, because, it's a small component of overall, domestically made product. Is it a wholesale product? And it's a complete product, but it's wholesale. Remember, if you're buying stuff abroad and you're slapped with a tariff and then you resell it here, even if you pass on the full cost of that tariff, that if it's 10%, it's unless you're a zero margin product, what actually gets passed on to the consumer as a percent of the retail price is not going to be 10%. right? It is going to be some number maybe less than 10%. So, we wouldn't expect, a full increase. But the situation in which, the full cost of the tariff would be applied to the full retail price would be an example of, let's just say, I went to China and I bought a $3,000 MacBook Pro, and then I arrived in the US and customs saw that and said, how much should you pay for that? And I said, 3,000. And they say, okay, well, you need to put 150, you need to pay 150% tariff because it's, the final cost of that product. You brought it in, you paid for it. In that case, the full cost of that tariff gets, onto that. That's very like most of the impacts are actually going to be on the wholesale and the input side. Very few people are actually going out buying all their products abroad and then bringing it in, and then therefore, the final product, the final cost of that good is or that tariff is not passed on to the total final cost of that good. So anyways, that's just sort of to think about it, and we'll show these slides you get to later. Okay, so now we're going to move on. Stacey's, I think, going to take it from here, and she's going to talk about the tariff impacts on consumer sentiment.
Thank you, Ralph. That was a lot of great information. I took notes. Yes, so if you want to go ahead and flip it for me to the next slide, I'll cover a little bit on our methodology. The consumer sentiment data we are going to share here today is captured by our Mindshare survey. Data is now collected daily, and we survey thousands of consumers each day. We focused our questions on how tariffs might impact purchase decisions. All respondents have been demographically balanced to the US Census data, and we will continue to track these results daily. As we all know, tariffs are impacting consumer behavior. Roughly 1 in 2 consumers reported they did not plan to change their behavior. This was across both purchasers and non-purchasers. However, this leaves half who are either not aware of tariffs or concerned enough to delay purchases, make earlier purchases, or shift their focus to America-made products. How does this look now versus when we started collecting data in early March? We see responses are shifting over time. More respondents in April reported delaying their purchases or buying earlier than planned, which Ralph had mentioned a little bit in his information as well, compared to what we saw the first week of March. The column highlighted shows you where we are seeing this as of last Friday. So we took a read early March, the first week in April, and then we did another read last Friday. As you can see on this chart, we see the first week of March, 53% of people reported the tariffs would not impact their purchases. But as of Friday, that dropped to 48%. Also, delaying purchases increased from 13% to 18%. And planning to purchase earlier to avoid price increases grew by more than 3 percentage points. Is there an impact on these consumers buying more or less? Here we see tariffs are impacting those respondents who buy more, which makes sense if pricing is the key factor. 54% of consumers buying one product reported tariffs would not change their purchase behavior. Meanwhile, when consumers shop for more, they're more concerned about tariffs. Out of all the consumers who bought more than 20 products, only a third of them were not concerned about tariffs. This means 2/3 of bigger basket shoppers are being impacted by tariffs. Additionally, we see a stronger affinity for America-made purchases when buying more products, as well as consumers buying earlier than planned when buying more. Now let's dig into some of the category highlights around these purchases being made in the next 90 days. So here, this slide is focused on purchases being made in the next 3 months. Tariffs have had the greatest impact on consumers' plans to purchase major appliances. As illustrated by the taller column in the chart, we see purchase plans for smaller project categories such as lawn and garden and paint appear to be the least impacted. So that it makes sense. It's a higher ticket item. Next slide, please. Among those respondents planning to purchase these categories in the next 3 months, we see purchasing America-made products resonated for these top 3 categories: appliances, flooring, and plumbing, as highlighted by the arrows. Our last sentiment slide indicates the categories where consumers reported they would delay future purchases based on higher prices. The top 3 categories where consumers would delay were fitness, outdoor power equipment, and tools. So one might conclude around these categories being driven by larger project-based or replacement-heavy purchases for tools and outdoor power equipment, as well as fitness equipment, typically being more of a luxury purchase. Now, we are going to continue tracking all of these questions across our survey and in the future. And we also have additional data where we can dig into more specific categories and drill down a little bit further. So stay tuned. And now back to Ralph for the 2025 forecast expectations.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Stacey. Super interesting stuff, and it's actually a very good segue into what I'm going to talk about here on the home stretch here, and that is our forecast expectations. So, just wanted full disclosure. The 3 forecasts that I'm going to provide here, I'm going to show you our forecast for pricing of durable goods, shipments of durable goods, and then retail sales, at least broader retail sales. Now, this is sort of our freemium forecast product. We get very, very detailed on our forecasts, and I'll show you that at the end. We can go into very detailed categories in all of these forecasts. So, you don't have the time or bandwidth necessarily to go through all of those, but they are available and definitely part of our economic product subscription. And we revise these at minimum on a monthly basis. And if there are major policy changes or the macroeconomic winds shift, we will actually do a special update of our forecasts, on more than a monthly basis as we see that's needed. So, like I said, these are the 3 shipments that we have. Just to give you a high level review, we're deploying it's called a neural net model. It's a very, very accurate predictive model that essentially works like a brain. So, in all of our daily lives, the older we get, the more you rely on experience and learning from times that you were actually wrong. So what's great about these neural net models is that if you have good, healthy history of what's happened in the world, it works much more like a brain and much better than some of the older linear forecast models of the past. And I've been forecasting for over a decade now, and these neural net models are the best models that I've ever worked with. And not only are they very, very accurate, much more accurate, which ultimately is all we really care about, but they're very, very flexible, and they scale quickly, and they run very, very fast. Some of these models, that have the older models would take hours or days to actually run and produce a solution. These things run in seconds. It's just absolutely astounding how quickly these models run. So it makes it not just easier to run these in a production environment, but say, for example, if any clients come to us and they say, hey, we actually have our own data, can you run it through your model and spit out a solution or a forecast? We can do that, and we can turn it around relatively quickly. So one of the things that you're going to see on the slides going forward is this thing called a MAPE. So this is my, a very, very punny slide here about just like, what is a MAPE? You don't necessarily have to, read through all of this, but all you need to know is that a MAPE is a measure of accuracy, and the lower the MAPE, the better. MAPE stands for mean absolute percentage error. So if your MAPE is, say, like 2.5%, it means on average, your error rate, you were off by 2.5%. And so you want that number to be lower. So when I go through this, I'll just kind of show you what that MAPE is on these following slides. We also have the ability in our forecasts to actually do what's called scenario-based forecasting. So we present our best foot forward, which is called our baseline, and that's going to be our most accurate model, is our baseline model. However, you don't have to take our word for it. We have both baseline as well as pessimistic models and optimistic models. And if you don't like, our assumptions and our baseline model, you can come to say, hey, actually, we prefer the pessimistic model, or we prefer the optimistic model. We can actually do scenario-based forecasting, so we can tune these things to your view of the future of the world, and you don't have to take into account our view of the future of the world. We can tailor that to, if you think there's going to be, a black swan event, or you think things are going to get way worse with the tariff and deportation, say, environment, we can trade that. So anyways, I'm going to show you some scenarios going forward, and this is just a description of how the scenarios vary. One, is that we get, our baseline is that we get a lot of trade deals done and finalized in 2025, and so this whole thing kind of blows over a bit. The other is that we actually get few. This is the pessimistic view, is that we get few trade deals done, and things don't get finalized until next year or the year after. Second forecast or second assumption is that in the baseline that we think inflation will continue a downward trend versus reaccelerating. Third is that deportation moderates, versus in the downside or the pessimistic scenario, deportations actually increase to a level that hurts labor supply, consumer demand, and productivity. Again, some differences between a base or pessimistic is that treasury yields fall and they increase, and then last, employment growth continues to be solid versus slow down. Okay, I think we're going to, actually it's going to be on the next slide here, but this is our durable goods shipment forecast. Again, this is on a dollar volume on a more broader basis here, but our forecast model, our downside or our pessimistic model, is forecasting a 2% drop in shipments as a result of, say, a more pronounced and prolonged trade war. So again, it's not totally forecasting doom and gloom, even in a very severe trade war scenario, at least as far as shipments, are concerned. And you can see here, actually, the purple line is our pessimistic model in the 2025 forecast, and that light blue line is our base case. And you can actually see in this scenario that in the pessimistic model, we're actually forecasting slightly higher shipments than the baseline model. And you say, why is that? Well, that's actually people rushing to buy a bunch of stuff. And that's why in the short run, we think shipments will increase in the pessimistic model, but then fall below the base case, throughout the end of the year. And in any sense, our base case scenario, and this is a blind test, like I went back and actually tested these models in a blind way for 2024, like how accurate would this model have been in 2024 had I predicted all of this in 2023 using only data that was available in 2023? Well, you could see here that our MAPE was very low, 1.4%. So you could see just behind the dark blue line in 2024 is our light blue line. And the reason why it's hard to see the light blue line is because it was nearly spot on what actually occurred in 2024. Again, this is a blind forecast, and I'm showing you for 2024. So a pretty highly accurate model. I think this is actually where we have a poll here. I think it's our last poll. Do we want to run that now? I can't see if it's in the chat, but
yes, we will launch it now. Thank you.
So you'll see, and I'm sort of playing into all of this. So I think the poll is something like what percentage of manufactured goods that are actually sold in the U.S. are made in the U.S. or actually made with U.S. Made in the U.S. even with foreign components, essentially assembled here. So while that's running, I'm going to show you an example here of, this is our pricing forecast, and essentially, our pricing forecast in 2025 is really an increase of only like 3 to 5% on the high end, and that comes fairly early in the year through the middle of the year, and then it sort of trails off. And in fact, in the pessimistic scenario, in the very, very worst case scenario, we actually see prices in the long run fall more, and this is actually reflecting the Fed stepping in to intervene. So, if things get really out of hand, the Fed has a dual mandate. So one is control prices. The other is actually to help support full employment. So if we see a lot of job losses because of over tariffing, the Fed can step in and actually lower rates, which would potentially help counteract a lot of other inflationary effects. So in the long run, we're actually there's deflationary effects that come from a scenario like we might get into, and there's inflationary effects. And in the pessimistic scenario, the deflationary effects actually from things like poor economic performance prevails. And so we would actually get lower price growth in the pessimistic scenario. Although in the short run, in the pessimistic scenario, price growth would actually be higher. I'm not sure what so you're already thinking, well, why, if we're seeing, baseline 10% and, in China, we're seeing a proposal of tariffs of like 150%. Why is the model only suggesting we're going to see like, a 5% growth rate, for example, in prices, 3 to 5%? Well, it's because if you didn't know this, and I actually looked this up a few days ago, the answer to the question in the poll is over half. So about 52% thereabouts of all manufactured goods sold in the U.S. are actually made in the U.S., either completely made in the U.S. with U.S. inputs or made in the U.S. with some foreign inputs. So, that's it's hard to make a case for a majorly large inflationary environment when due to tariffs, when still a majority of things are made in the U.S., even if they use some foreign components.
So, Ralph,
yes, go ahead.
The results for the poll taken here today was the majority of people perceived it to be 0 to 25%. So.
There we go. Yeah. So it's go look. Don't take my word for it. Go look it up. So again, maybe that's going to help lessen some of the overall inflationary concerns about the worst case impact of tariffs on pricing. And the last here, I won't go too much more. Oh, the other thing I was going to say about the slide, sorry, is that in cases where we do see our MAPE slightly higher, like in this case, our error rate, was instead of 1.4%, it was 2.4%. But the good news is that it was biased, it was high. So what we can do in this scenario is, if we knew we were consistently high, say in 2024, I can subtract that error rate from our future forecast, and that actually, gives a more reasonable looking forecast, because I can say, all right, well, whatever reason the model is off, we can just apply that correction. So in this case, I actually applied a 2.4% correction to both scenarios, and you could see they pick up that trend line from what actually happened in 2024 quite well. And last here, again, this is our retail sales, excluding autos and gas stations. But we do expect, even in the worst case scenario, as far as retail sales overall, there to be about 150 basis point hit to in the pessimistic scenario versus the base model to retail sales. An example of this, here with numbers is that, in the baseline, we would expect retail sales to grow, say, 2.7% on a year-over-year basis versus 1.2%. So we still expect retail sales to grow, even in the worst case scenario. It's just they'll grow at a slower rate. So we aren't expecting, the sky to fall as a result of all of this, even in very pessimistic scenarios. So anyways, I want to make sure I've got a little bit longer than expected, but I want to make sure we do have some time for questions here. So we'll go into Q&A. And if you would like a more detailed, last thing I'll say is, if you would like a more detailed forecast preview of a category that's more relevant to your particular product or industry, we have that. I'll go back to that in a second, but we can do BYO, bring your own data. So if you have industry data from AHAM or OPEI or the Home Improvement Research Institute, you can send that to us. We can run it through our model and spit you out results. For our CPI, we have breakouts, not just forecast breakouts, not just for appliances, but we can do major appliances, laundry appliances, others. We get down into these very specific subcategories for price forecasts. And then for retail sales, we get very detailed breakouts, say by electronics and appliance stores. And then even then we can break out by just appliance stores, electronics, food and beverage stores, pharmacies and drugstores. We have very, very detailed retail sales forecasts. So anyways, I'll just leave it at that. And, we have a little over 5 minutes here for questions.
You mentioned that appliance prices are a key driver of inflation in March. Do you expect that trend to continue as tariffs go into effect, or will we see shifts across other categories?
Well, the first thing I was going to say, we are in a policy du jour, right? We're getting policy changes on a day-to-day basis. So it could be one day I'm going to say yes, based on today's policy, I expect prices to continue to rise and accelerate in that, in that particular group or category. And then the next day it may be, oh, well, based on what we see today, things might not be as bad. But what I can say is that appliances, in particular, are complex goods, so to speak, relative to other goods out there, especially manufactured goods. I think we should expect to continue to see some acceleration in price growth in that market. However, there are a couple of reasons why I think there is a ceiling on appliances as far as price growth is concerned. And that is one, we still make appliances in this country, just they may still use some foreign components. The fact that there still is appliances made in the U.S. means that there is sort of that upper, that there's a lower ceiling there. And the other is, and there's going to be folks who are more knowledgeable than me, but I would like to think that margins on appliances aren't zero, right? That they tend to be more maybe middle to higher margin products, which means there potentially is more of an ability of producers to actually maybe absorb some of that, or at least wait and see, right? They think it's going to be short run. They may just wait and see, maybe eat some of it now, and then things will be back to normal in a few months.
Okay, next question. Has there been analysis short-term, I'm reading it directly. Has there been analysis short-term increase in sales of refurbished, reboxed, secondhand durable goods? Anything around that?
We don't. Those are not details that I think anyone really has any credible data like in the aggregate to track. My intuition certainly tells me that is potentially going to be the case. And in fact, I was just on a call this morning with a reporter from USA Today, and one of the things that came out of the conversation was, okay, well, what consumers can do to potentially save on pricing? Well, one of them actually is to go and maybe, if they don't want to go down market totally, maybe they go to a reboxed, refurbished, or used product. And if there is this huge surge right now to actually go buy new by some consumers, of consumer durable goods, then that necessitates, I would say it doesn't necessitate, but I think it opens up a much more active used good market. So if I decide to buy that fridge I maybe was going to buy later in the year, upgrade my fridge, and my current fridge is still good, if I don't turn it into my beer fridge in the garage, I might put it on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace and try to sell it. And so if that increase in sales activity goes up, that actually could drive down in the short run sales prices of used goods, and it might increase for more activity on the used good market. And that is a way that some consumers, might try to upgrade without necessarily, having to rush to buy new or rush to buy or get caught with a higher tariff product.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more. This is kind of a heavy hitter. What are your odds for a recession in 2025 or 2026?
Our baseline case does not call for a recession at all. So on the baseline case, we're pretty close to zero. I would say, our odds is given the full spectrum of like optimistic versus very pessimistic. Even on the pessimistic side, it's calling for almost flat growth. So I would say our odds, although not zero, they're not the 50 or 60% that other forecasts forecasters out there have been saying over the last month, I think we're probably down between I'd say a 10 to 20% odds. So much lower than other forecasters on the market.
Well, that's a good way to end the call then. Ease some people's minds on the issues. Thank you again for everybody that attended today. Thank you, Ralph, for all of your great insights. Again, if you would like to request a forecast preview, please scan the QR code and we will be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you all.